Why do you sound like a beginner in cloud engineering interviews? Today, I want to talk about a very specific problem that I see in cloud engineering interviews. And it's one of the most frustrating problems to have because the person experiencing it is usually not a complete beginner. They may already have years of experience in IT, they may have an AWS certification, a few projects on GitHub, and actually enough technical knowledge to recognize almost every service in their job description. But when the interview starts, they somehow still sound like somebody who has only just started learning cloud. And the strange part is that their answer can be technically correct. So the easiest way for me to explain why this happens is to give you two candidates answering the exact same question. We're going to assume that they have the same technical background, the same AWS certification, and also the same portfolio project. In other words, neither of these two candidates that we're going to go through has an advantage on paper. So the question is this: a small retailer gets unpredictable traffic during promotions. Downtime loses revenue, customer orders require relational transactions, and the operations team is small. How would you design the application on AWS? So candidate one will say something like, I would use Route 53, CloudFront, ALB, EC2 autoscaling across multi-AZ, RDS, S3, WAF, CloudWatch. So you can see what happens right now, right? You can see what this is looking like. Now, there's obviously nothing ridiculous about the answer. Every service that they named could belong in an architecture. And if you've been studying AWS for a minute, the answer probably sounds very familiar. But then the interviewer will ask you one very simple follow-up question. Why did you choose EC2? And this is normally where the answer will actually begin to fall apart because the candidate explains what EC2 is. And then they mention autoscaling again. And before they know it, they're giving the interviewer even more AWS terminology without ever answering why EC2 was the right decision for this particular company. Now let's hear candidate 2 answer the exact same question. Candidate 2 will say something like, yes, absolutely. So before I choose a service, I want to clarify a few things. How much traffic are we expecting during a promotion? How much downtime and data loss can the business tolerate? Are the promotions scheduled? And what does the current team already know how to operate? But assuming the application is stateless, the traffic is unpredictable, the order data needs relational transactions, and the operations team is fairly small. I'd probably run the application across two availability zones behind an ALB and start with ECS on Fargate. The main reason I'd start with Fargate is that this team is small, so I don't want them spending unnecessary time managing and patching EC2 host. Now, Fargate may cost more than EC2 if the application is running at high utilization all the time. So I'd compare the real traffic pattern and total operating cost before making the final decision, right? Unprompted, candidate 2 named their own trade-off that they were making. For the order data, I'd start with RDS multi-AZ because data's relational and we need failover, and I keep the application running, as you can see. So the answer is very, very different. So you can see what they're kind of going through. They're going through the trade-offs. So let's kind of go through what happened. Both candidates, candidate 1 and candidate 2, knew broadly the same AWS services. Both of them produce an architecture that could make sense in production. But if you were the interviewer, which candidate would you trust to work on the real system? For most people, it's clearly candidate 2. Well, it should be for everyone. And the reason isn't that a candidate 2 memorized a longer list of services. The actual reason is that you can follow their thinking and their problem-solving process. You can hear which requirements mattered, why they chose one option over another, what trade-off they noticed, and how they would find out whether the design actually worked. So candidate 1 gave the interviewer a list of AWS products and services, whereas candidate 2 made a series of engineering decisions. And if you already have years of experience in IT, this is why the problem feels so frustrating. You walk into an interview with real professional experience, but the way that you answer actually hides your experience. The interviewer doesn't hear the incidents that you handled, the users you supported, or systems that you worked around. They just hear a collection of AWS services that have come from a tutorial directly. So the interviewer hasn't erased your experience. Your answer has simply failed to translate that experience into judgment the interviewer can evaluate. And that is the main point of this video. A cloud interviewer is usually asking you a decision question, but most candidates answer it like a memory question. If you've ever left an interview thinking that I knew that, I just couldn't get it out properly, there's a good chance that this is what happened. You knew what the service did, but you haven't practiced making the decision behind it easy for another person to follow. And later throughout this video, I'm going to explain why intelligent, hardworking people can repeat this exact same problem for months on end. They leave the interview disappointed, prepare even harder, and then unknowingly practice the same weakness again. But first, we really need to understand what the stronger candidate here is actually doing. So in this video, I'm going to break down exactly what the second candidate did differently, and I'll give you a 3-question structure that you can use for almost any cloud interview answer, and then we'll change one of the requirements to see whether the candidate genuinely understands the architecture or has simply memorized a more impressive response. So if you're new here, my name is Suleiman. I've spent more than 11 years working across software, cloud engineering, architect, DevOps, and consulting, including more than 7 years working with AWS directly. A large part of that work has involved explaining technical decisions to clients, engineers, people who don't necessarily share the same technical experience or context as me. And from there, I've built my own consulting company, my own education company. I've got 2 YouTube channels, 3 YouTube channels actually, and I have my software company where we personalize AI certifications for students. Now, before we go any further, this video isn't about changing your accent or using bigger buzzwords or pretending to be more confident than you actually feel. Good communication also can't disguise a genuine gap in technical ability, and I don't really want to imply that it can. The problem we're dealing with is much more specific. You may know the AWS services, but the way you answer can hide all of the judgment that connects those services together. The interviewer can't see what's happening inside of your head. They can only evaluate the reasoning that you make visible. So let's look at why the first answer fails to do that. When somebody's still learning AWS, the easiest way to answer an architecture question is to search their memory for services that are associated with the words in the question. So if the interviewer says high availability, they remember multi-availability zones, a load balancer, and also scaling. If the interviewer mentions a database, they remember RDS and DynamoDB. If security comes up, they think about WAF, IAM on KMS. Again, none of these services are automatically wrong. The issue is the direction in which the candidate is thinking. They're starting with a service and then trying to make it fit the problem. An experienced engineer usually works in the complete opposite direction. They begin by trying to understand what the system actually needs to do, what can go wrong, and which constraints matter the most. Is the priority availability, cost, security, latency, recovery time, or just keeping the system simple enough for a small team to operate it? Once they understand that, the services become possible ways of meeting those requirements. So a beginner sounding answer is service, feature, more services. An engineering answer is problem, decision, and proof. So the point is not that naming the AWS service is bad. Of course, you eventually need to say what you would use. The point is that each service should sound like the result of a requirement that you understood and a decision that you made, rather than a word that you were waiting for an opportunity to mention. This also explains why certification knowledge doesn't automatically turn into interview confidence. A certification can give you extremely useful vocabulary, structure, and baseline knowledge. But in an exam, you're usually given a defined scenario, a limited number of possible answers, and enough information to recognize the intended choice. In an interview, some of the information may deliberately be missing. You may need to ask a question, state an assumption, choose between several valid options, and then explain the conditions under which you would change your mind. That is a different skill. And simply learning another 20 AWS services will not automatically solve it. So the mistake isn't getting certified. The mistake is expecting one kind of practice to produce a completely different skill. Certification study often trains you to recognize a strong answer from a fixed set of options. In an interview, we'll ask you to create and defend an answer when several options could work. Those skills are related, but they are not inherently the same. If most of your preparation has been erased on recognition, it makes complete sense that you struggle when the interviewer suddenly asks for judgment. It doesn't mean you learned nothing. It means that you are trying to solve a different problem with the same method. So how do you actually fix this without memorizing a completely different answer for every single possible interview question? The structure that I recommend has 3 parts: problem, decision, and proof. It's simple enough to remember under pressure, but it forces you to reveal the parts of your thinking that interviewers are actually trying to assess. The first part is the problem. Before choosing an architecture, make it very clear what you believe you're solving. That may mean that you ask the interviewer for more information, or if you want to move quickly, stating the assumptions that you're going to use. For example, you may say that the important requirements here are unpredictable approach of traffic, limited acceptable downtime, relational order data, and small operational team. That one sentence immediately helps the interviewer actually understand what is going to drive the rest of your answer. More importantly, it prevents you from designing an imaginary system with no users, no budget, no recovery target, and no team responsible for operating it. The second part is decision. Once you've established the important requirements, make a recommendation and explain why it fits. You don't need to list every service that could possibly work. You can choose one sensible approach and mention a credible alternative and then explain the trade-offs that you're accepting. For example, you may say that I would begin with Fargate because the team is small and reducing host management work matters. EC2 could be cheaper at sustained utilization, but the team would take on more patching and capacity responsibility. Now the interviewer can hear that Fargate was a choice connected to the team and workload. You've also shown that you understand that EC2 isn't wrong. It simply creates a different balance between infrastructure costs and operational responsibility. So the third part is proof. This is where you explain how you'd find out whether your design actually works. What would you test? Which failure would you simulate safely? Which logs, metrics, or alarms will tell you what happened? And what business result are you ultimately trying to protect? It might sound a little bit like this. I would load test the proportional traffic, remove a task, exercise a supported database failover process, and measure recovery against the agreed target. That gives the interviewer the full chain from the problem that you understood to the decision that you made to the evidence that you used to validate it. So problem, decision, and proof. You don't need to memorize a perfect speech for every AWS service. What you need to practice is the order in which you think, because that order can travel with you from one scenario to another. So at this point, you may be thinking that candidate 2 only sounded stronger because they had memorized a better response. And that is a pretty fair concern, because anybody could take the answer from this video, practice it 10 to 20 times, and then repeat it in an interview. So there is one more test. Change one of the facts and then see whether the answer changes with it. Imagine the interviewer then follows up with this. The company already has engineers who are very experienced operating EC2, and the budget has become the largest constraint. Does your answer change? If you memorize that Fargate is the correct answer, this follow-up puts you in a lot of trouble. But if you understand why you chose Fargate in the first place, you can say that yes, it probably does change my answer. In the original situation, one of my main reasons for choosing Fargate was that the team was small and I wanted to reduce the operational work. My main reason for choosing Fargate was to reduce the operational work for a small team, but if this company already has engineers who are very comfortable operating EC2, then that disadvantage becomes much smaller. And if cost is now the biggest constraint, EC2 may also be economical for a workload that runs at high utilization for long periods. So I'd model the traffic and the total operating costs, and I would seriously reconsider EC2 auto-scaling, while keeping the same availability, security, monitoring, and recovery requirements. That's a much more realistic picture of what experience sounds like. It doesn't mean acting as if you know one correct answer to every question. It means being able to make a sensible decision with the information available and then update that decision when the situation changes. And this is also why confidence doesn't mean stubbornly defending your first answer. An experienced engineer is allowed to change their mind. The important thing is being able to explain which new piece of information changed the decision. And that matters even more now that AI can produce a polished architecture answer in literally seconds. The first answer has become cheap. Almost anybody can ask an AI tool to design a highly available application and repeat what it gives them. The follow-up question is where the interviewer starts to discover whether the reasoning actually belongs to you. They change the budget, tighten the recovery target, or introduce a security requirement. And then they watch whether your architecture actually changes with the problem. Now, AI can give you a list of services. It cannot sit in the interview with you and own the decisions for you. Now, that brings us to the part of the problem that has very little to do with AWS. Imagine that you finish an interview on Friday and you know it didn't go very well. So over the weekend, you do what feels like the responsible thing. You watch another architecture video, you reread your project documentation, and perhaps ask AI to write a cleaner version of the answer. Then you practice saying it until the words sound a lot smoother. Monday arrives, you go back to work, your normal responsibilities take over, and eventually the urgency that you had just fades away. Another interview appears 6 weeks later, somebody changes one requirement, and the same thing happens again. This is how people can spend 6 to 12 months preparing without changing the thing that keeps costing them interviews. They are putting in genuine effort, but the effort is happening inside the same closed loop. And afterwards, they normally tell themselves that I actually knew it, I was just nervous. Sometimes that is true. Interviews are stressful, and experienced engineers can explain something badly under real pressure. But if this has happened several times and your confidence repeatedly disappears when an interviewer asks why, then nerves probably aren't the whole explanation. The interview may be exposing the way that you've been learning. Let's say that you've built an application with private subnets. Before the interview, you reread your notes, review the architecture diagram, and practice explaining what a private subnet is. When an interview asks you why use one subnet, you will give the definition that you've prepared. But then they ask how the application reaches an AWS service without traveling over the internet. What happens if that path fails? Or which logs would you inspect if the request is denied? And that is normally where the confidence disappears. It isn't because you forgot what a private subnet is. It's because your preparation stopped at recognition and explanation while the interviewer moved into decisions, failure, and evidence. So the belief that I want you to challenge is that more preparation always means more readiness. It doesn't. More of the right preparation can make you ready. More of the wrong preparation can simply make the same weakness harder to notice. Self-studying is extremely useful when you need to acquire information. Free docs, videos, courses can teach you how a service works, and for many people, that's exactly where they should begin. But self-studying reaches a natural ceiling when the person doing the work is also the only person deciding whether the work is actually good enough. You choose the question, decide how to deeply answer it, decide when the project is finished, and then you mark your own answer. The problem is that the blind spot you need to correct is, by definition, the thing that you cannot currently see. So you may not notice that the assumption sounds unrealistic, that the alternative that you rejected was stronger, or that your answer became vague at the exact moment the conversation moved into networking or security. If nobody interrupts you there, you can finish the explanation believing that it was reasonably good. That is why asking for qualified feedback is not an admission that you are incapable. Code gets reviewed, architecture gets reviewed, production changes get challenged before they are released. Good engineers do not avoid inspection to prove that they can do everything alone. They use it because invisible mistakes are very expensive. Your interview preparation should work the exact same way. Could you eventually solve all of this by yourself? Possibly. You could also technically walk from New York to Los Angeles. The real question is not whether walking is possible, it is whether walking is an intelligent route when the destination matters and time is passing. But I don't want you to misunderstand the analogy. Simply buying another course or program is not the flight. You can pay for 10 courses and continue doing the same private preparation. The flight is actually the feedback loop. You make a decision, somebody qualified challenges it, they change your requirement, you discover that part of your reasoning doesn't hold, and then you correct it, test it, and explain it again. The shorter that correction cycle becomes, the fewer months that you spend practicing something that falls apart in a real interview. That feedback could come from a senior engineer at work, a technically stronger peer, a serious mock interview group, a mentor, or a structured program. The format matters less than whether the person can genuinely inspect both the architecture and your explanation. Now, I'm not going to tell you that every month of delay costs exactly $12,000 because nobody can honestly guarantee you a salary that you would have earned or the date that you would have been hired. But the delay does still have a real cost. It can mean another interview cycle with the same blind spot, another month with stronger evidence, and another month in which your options remain exactly where they were before. The current salary may keep life very comfortable, but comfort does not make time free. So here is the test that I want you to use. Step 1. Open the strongest AWS project that you've built and choose 3 of the most important architecture decisions. For each one, use problem decision proof. Then change one constraint. Cut the budget in half, increase the traffic, introduce regulated data, tighten the recovery requirement, or hand the system to a much less experienced operational team. Now explain it again in 90 seconds. If the answer changes logically, you're beginning to own the architecture. If it collapses, that doesn't mean you aren't capable. It has shown you exactly where your understanding ends, which is far more useful than watching another general interview video. You can use AI for this, but don't ask it to rescue you with the perfect answer. Instead, ask it to act like a cloud engineering interviewer. Do not answer for me, challenge every important service choice, and ask what alternative I rejected and change one requirement at a time. Use AI to reveal the gap, not hide it behind language that sounds better than your actual understanding. And once you've done that privately, put the answer in front of somebody qualified to challenge it. You can experience that discomfort during practice while you still have a chance to correct the answer, or during the real interview after the hiring decision has already been made. Now, this is where I want you to take an important distinction, because taking responsibility for your career does not mean pretending that your circumstances aren't real. Your employer may genuinely refuse to move you into cloud work. Your partner may have completely reasonable questions about time or money involved in a career transition. You may have children or a demanding job or financial responsibilities that prevent you from behaving as if nothing else matters. Those are real constraints, right? And a sensible plan needs to account for all of them. But constraint is not the same thing as an owner. Your boss may control whether you receive an internal cloud opportunity. They do not control whether you build evidence outside of that opportunity. Your partner should have a voice in decisions that affect the household, and a responsible plan should also account for that. But once those boundaries are agreed, you still own whether the time you have becomes another course or inspected practice. The market controls which roles exist, but it does not control whether the next project that you build is another copy tutorial or something you can genuinely defend. Responsibility isn't about blaming yourself for everything that has happened. It's about preparing the things that you cannot control for the next action that still belongs to you. You don't need to quit your job tomorrow. In fact, for most people, that would create unnecessary pressure. Your current salary can give you a stable runway from which to build on your next move. But the runway has to lead to takeoff eventually, right? It cannot become the reason that you spend another year preparing privately without allowing anybody else to inspect the work. Every week, you're effectively voting for a preparation method. The question is whether that method has earned another vote. If your current approach is producing stronger projects, clearer answers, and better interview results, then you need to continue with it. But if you've been studying for months, your answer still collapses after why, and you keep returning to another course certification, then working harder inside the same method is not persistence, right? At that point, persistence means being willing to change the method. Now, not everybody watching needs to join a program or book a call, right? If you're still exploring cloud and you haven't built anything substantial enough to explain, begin there. Build one small system and use problem, decision, and proof to talk through it. You need real decisions before feedback becomes actually useful. But if cloud is already the direction that you've chosen, you have studied AWS, earned a cert, built projects, or you've worked in IT, and your reasoning still falls apart under follow-up questions, more private preparation may no longer be what moves you forward, right? Now, inside of my academy, we don't give you polished interview scripts to memorize. The process is designed around attempting realistic problems, making your own architecture decisions, receiving practitioner challenge, and then revising both the solution and the explanation. You will still have to do all of the work. Getting support does not transfer responsibility for your career to us, right? Now, what the right feedback can do is help expose the mistake during practice instead of after another rejection. That is the real difference between walking and flying, right? The destination has not changed, and nobody's removing the need for you to do the work. You just simply stop pretending that the longest available route is somehow more admirable. Bring your strongest project and, if possible, the interview question or follow-up that keeps exposing you. You can book a call directly with us, and on the call, we'll look at what you've already tried and whether this is a problem that the Academy can help you connect. If it is, the team will explain the current program options, support, pricing, and terms. If it isn't for you, then we'll tell you that as well. Now, you can also use the problem, decision, proof exercise from this video independently. But whether you speak to us or you want our help, and by the way, we've helped over 900 people make the switch into cloud, don't leave the next interview and automatically prescribe yourself to another certification. Ask a better question. Where did my reasoning stop being mine? Then go back to the same 3 parts: problem, decision, proof. A beginner tells the interviewer which AWS service exists, and an engineer makes the path from requirement to decision to evidence easy to follow. Once you can do that consistently, you stop trying to sound experienced and you give the interviewer something much more valuable: a reason to trust you with work. So, if any of this was helpful and you need my help breaking into tech or landing a 6-figure cloud role, and you've tried a lot of things yourself and you're not getting any success, you can book a call directly with my team. Link in the description below. We've helped over 900 people. One of my students this week got hired in a remote tech role, earning $170K a year, 5K bonus, and unlimited PTO. Again, go through this channel. You can look at my main channel, Tech with Sulaiman. You'll see all the evidence, all the proof that you need to see that we are real. We are the best at what we do. And I'll see you on the next one.